I was tying a ribbon around the centerpieces when I realized my hands were shaking, not from nerves, but from the quiet certainty that nothing in this room was meant for me anymore. The hall smelled like fresh lilies and polished wood. Everything looked calm, beautiful even, the kind of beauty people trust without asking questions. I paused, ribbon half looped, and stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall across the room. The woman looking back at me appeared composed. Helpful, present, no one would have guessed she was standing inside the ruins of her own life. I remember thinking how strange it was that grief could be so orderly. Chairs aligned in perfect rows, programs stacked neatly on a table. Names printed in careful calligraphy. Love apparently had a schedule. Someone laughed behind me. A soft, familiar laugh. I didn't turn around, I already knew who it was. I could hear her voice even when she wasn't speaking, the way you hear a song you used to love long after it stopped playing. I tightened the ribbon until it cut slightly into my finger. The sting felt deserved, grounding. A reminder that I was still here, still capable of feeling something sharp and real. This wasn't how I imagined my life unfolding at this age. I had expected quieter days, gentler concerns, maybe loneliness, yes. But not this particular kind of fracture, the kind that doesn't explode, doesn't scream, just settles into your bones and waits. People kept thanking me that day, for organizing, for stepping in, for being so strong. I nodded when they spoke, smiled when expected, played my part with practiced ease. I had learned, over the years, how to hold my face in place even when my thoughts wandered somewhere dangerous. Because the truth was, I hadn't come here to celebrate love. I had come to finish something. And as I finally tied that ribbon into a neat bow, I understood with startling clarity that this wedding was not the beginning of a marriage. It was the ending of something much older, something I had trusted without question. Before I go any further, let me slow down for just a moment. If you're listening to this while washing dishes, or sitting alone in your car, or lying awake when the house has finally gone quiet, I want you to know you're not intruding on anything private. Stories like this don't belong to one person. They belong to anyone who's ever loved deeply and then had to learn how to live with what followed. I've been told that people listen from all kinds of places: kitchens at midnight, long commutes, hospital waiting rooms, bedrooms where sleep won't come. Wherever you are right now, I hope you feel like you're sitting across from me at a small table, maybe with a cup of something warm between us. This isn't a story about anger shouted out loud. It's about the kind that settles quietly. The kind you carry politely. The kind no one notices because you still show up. So take a breath with me, because what I'm about to tell you didn't happen all at once. It unfolded slowly, the way most real betrayals do, softly enough that you almost convince yourself nothing is wrong. Almost. Before everything changed, my life moved at a pace I understood. I woke early not because I had to, but because my body preferred it that way. Morning light would slip through the curtains in thin, forgiving lines, and I'd lie there for a few minutes, listening to the house breathe. The refrigerator hum, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. These were small, dependable sounds. They told me where I was. After my mother died, the house had felt too large at first, like it was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. But over time, I learned how to live inside that space without feeling lost. I took care of the things she used to handle: the bills, the plants, the small rituals that kept the days from slipping away unnoticed. My father struggled more than I did. Grief aged him quickly, though he would have denied it if anyone asked. He forgot things, left cupboards open, stared out the window for long stretches as if he were listening for a voice that no longer answered. I worried about him, but I also trusted him. He had always been steady, quiet, the kind of man who showed love through presence rather than words. And then there was her. She had been my best friend for decades, long enough that our lives had grown around each other in invisible ways. She knew which stories not to tell me when I was tired. I knew when to call her without needing a reason. We shared the kind of familiarity that comes from years of witnessing each other through marriages, mistakes, disappointments, and slow recoveries. When she started coming by more often after my mother's passing, I felt relief, not suspicion. She brought food my father would actually eat, sat with him when I had errands to run, laughed gently at his old stories even when she'd heard them before. I remember thinking how grateful I was that he wasn't alone when I couldn't be there. Our routines adjusted naturally. Sunday dinners became a little fuller, conversations stretched longer. The house felt warmer with another voice in it. I mistook that warmth for healing. I still worked part-time then, still had my own quiet independence. I would leave in the mornings and come back to find them sitting together, cups of tea growing cold between them. They looked comfortable, at ease. I told myself that was a good thing. Nothing felt wrong, not clearly, not yet. There were moments, small and easily dismissed, that I didn't know how to name at the time. A glance that lingered just a second too long. A pause in conversation when I entered the room. The way her hand rested on his arm as she spoke, familiar but not inappropriate. I noticed these things and then immediately explained them away. Grief changes people. Loneliness seeks companionship. That was the story I told myself. Life continued in its gentle rhythm. Groceries, appointments, evenings spent reading or watching something mindless on television. I believed we were moving forward slowly together. I believed I was part of a quiet recovery, a family finding its balance again. Looking back, I realize how desperately I wanted that to be true. Because when you've already lost one person you love, you're willing to overlook a great deal just to keep from losing another. The first moment of discomfort didn't arrive like a revelation. It slipped in quietly, the way doubt often does, disguised as nothing more than a fleeting thought. I came home earlier than usual one afternoon, the sky still bright enough to feel like the day hadn't made up its mind yet. The house was unusually still. No television, no clinking of cups. I remember setting my bag down and listening just for a second to see if I could locate the familiar rhythm of voices I'd grown used to hearing. They were in the kitchen. I could hear her laughing, not loud but warm, unguarded. My father's voice followed, softer, lower than I was accustomed to hearing it. I stood in the hallway longer than I should have, not because I was trying to eavesdrop, but because something about the tone of that exchange felt private in a way I hadn't heard before. When I stepped into the kitchen, the laughter stopped too quickly. They turned toward me almost in unison. She smiled, a little too carefully. My father cleared his throat and reached for his cup, though it was already in his hand. Nothing inappropriate had happened, I could see that clearly. And yet the air felt altered, like a room after someone has closed a window. We spoke about ordinary things, dinner plans, the weather, an article she'd read earlier that day. But the ease was gone, replaced by something measured. I told myself I was imagining it, that grief had made me sensitive, that not every shift in atmosphere meant something. Still, the feeling followed me. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice patterns I hadn't before. She knew his schedule better than I did, anticipated his needs without asking, finished his sentences with a familiarity that unsettled me, though I couldn't have explained why. I caught myself watching them the way one watches strangers, trying to understand the shape of something new. Once, I found her coat draped over the back of a chair long after she'd supposedly left. Another time, my father mentioned a movie they'd seen together, one I hadn't known about. These were small things, harmless things, but they accumulated quietly, like dust you don't see until the light hits it just right. I tried to talk myself out of my discomfort. I reminded myself that she had been my friend long before any of this, that my father was an adult capable of forming his own connections. That companionship was not betrayal. And yet there were moments when I felt like a guest in my own home. The worst part was the way my instincts argued with my reason. I would feel a tightening in my chest, a sense of something unspoken pressing at the edges of my awareness, and then immediately scold myself for being suspicious. I didn't want to be that person, the one who saw shadows where there were none. One evening, as we sat together after dinner, she reached for my father's hand while making a point in conversation. It was brief, almost unconscious. She removed it just as quickly. Neither of them acknowledged it. I did, but I said nothing. That night, lying awake in my bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to identify exactly what I was afraid of. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet dread of being the last person to understand something everyone else already knew. I told myself that if something were truly wrong, it would announce itself more clearly. I was wrong about that. Some truths wait until you're already entangled before they show their face. They didn't sit me down. There was no careful preparation, no gentle easing into what they had decided to become. The truth arrived on an ordinary afternoon, delivered with the same casual tone one might use to announce a change in plans. We were in the living room. The windows were open, letting in a breeze that lifted the edges of the curtains just enough to be distracting. I remember noticing a small chip in the coffee table, something my mother had always meant to fix but never did. My father sat in his usual chair. She sat beside him, too close to be accidental. He cleared his throat. "We wanted to talk to you," he said. There was a pause long enough that I felt compelled to nod, as if giving permission for whatever was coming next. She smiled at me, the same smile she'd used for years, the one that used to mean reassurance. That day it meant something else entirely. "We've grown very close," she said. Her voice was steady, practiced. "Especially after your mother passed." I waited for the rest of the sentence, for the part where this stayed within the bounds of what I could understand, but it didn't. "We're getting married," my father added. The room didn't spin, I didn't cry. My body responded with an unnerving calm, the kind that settles in when your mind refuses to catch up. I remember thinking that I must have misheard him, that perhaps he'd said something adjacent to what I feared. "I'm sorry," I said, because it was the only phrase that came to me. "You're what?" She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten. "We didn't plan for this," she said quickly. "It just happened." I looked at my father, searching his face for something: hesitation, doubt, an apology that wasn't verbalized. What I found instead was relief. The relief of a man who had already made peace with his choice. When I asked, "In a few months," he said, "nothing big, just something simple." Simple, the word landed heavily. I wanted to ask questions that felt dangerous to voice. How long, who knew? Did anyone think about how this might feel for me? But the expressions on their faces suggested those conversations had already taken place, just not with me. "I hope you'll understand," she said. "We need your support." Support. Another word that carried too much weight. I stood up slowly, afraid that if I moved too quickly, something inside me would fracture. "I need some air," I said, and no one stopped me as I walked out onto the porch. The wood beneath my feet felt solid, reliable. I leaned against the railing and focused on my breathing, counting each inhale like it might anchor me to the present moment. Somewhere behind me, the door opened. "I know this is a lot," my father said. He stood a few steps away, his hands in his pockets. "But I'm not young anymore. I deserve happiness." I nodded because arguing with that felt cruel. I want you to be happy, I said, and meant it in a way that surprised me. What I didn't say was that I hadn't realized happiness would require my silence. Over the following days, the reality of their announcement settled in. Friends began calling. Relatives sent cautious messages. Some congratulated me as if I were part of something worth celebrating. Others avoided the topic altogether, their discomfort hanging between us in unsaid sentences. She called one evening, her tone overly gentle. "We were hoping you'd help with the planning," she said. "You're so good at organizing things, and it would mean a lot to your father." I hesitated. Every instinct in me recoiled. But another part, the part that had spent a lifetime keeping the peace, stepped forward instead. "Of course," I said. What I didn't understand then was that by agreeing, I wasn't giving my blessing. I was stepping into the place where everything would finally come into focus. Once I agreed to help with the wedding, my role shifted in ways I hadn't anticipated. I was no longer just the daughter or the friend. I became the quiet observer, positioned close enough to see the details no one thought to hide. Planning requires questions, dates, guest lists, seating arrangements. Each practical discussion opened small windows into a past I hadn't been invited to witness. She spoke easily about places they'd gone together, decisions they'd made without consulting anyone else. My father deferred to her often, a subtle but unmistakable change in their dynamic that I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was helping because it was the decent thing to do, because refusing would have caused unnecessary conflict. But beneath that reasoning was a growing need to understand how we had arrived here without my noticing sooner. I began paying attention in a way I hadn't before. There were emails between them that referenced conversations I'd never heard. A receipt tucked into a folder from a weekend trip I'd believed my father had spent alone. When I asked casual questions, the answers came smoothly, too smoothly, as if rehearsed long ago. One afternoon, while sorting through old documents to locate my mother's birth certificate for the paperwork, I came across a card. It was tucked between tax forms, out of place. Her handwriting was unmistakable. The message inside was short, intimate, written months before my mother's death. It wasn't explicit, it didn't need to be. "Thank you for understanding me when I didn't know how to speak. I don't know what I'd do without you." I sat there for a long time, the card resting in my hands like something fragile and sharp. The realization didn't arrive with rage. It came with a dull, aching clarity. This hadn't begun in grief. Grief had simply given it permission. I didn't confront them. Not then. I needed time to absorb what I'd found, to understand my own position in all of this. Anger felt too easy. What settled in its place was something heavier, a sense of being quietly edited out of my own family narrative. As the wedding drew closer, I noticed how carefully the guest list had been curated. Old friends of my mother were absent. Certain relatives weren't invited. The omissions felt intentional, a way of controlling the story before it could be questioned. That's when I understood what planning this wedding truly meant. This wasn't about flowers or menus. It was about presentation. About crafting a version of events that would be easier for others to accept. I realized that I had been invited into this process not because they wanted my opinion, but because they trusted my discretion. They believed I would protect them. I spent many evenings alone, sitting at my kitchen table with lists spread out before me, considering what responsibility I actually carried. I wasn't interested in revenge. I didn't want to humiliate anyone. But I also couldn't continue pretending that nothing had been taken from me without my consent. When she suggested that I give a short speech at the reception, framing it as a gesture of unity, something inside me settled. "I'll think about it," I said. That night I opened a blank document and began writing, not accusations, not confessions, just the truth, arranged carefully with restraint. I knew that if I was going to speak, it would have to be with dignity. Anything less would only confirm the narrative they were hoping to maintain. I wasn't planning to ruin a wedding. I was planning to stop disappearing. The day of the wedding arrived without ceremony in my chest. No rush of anticipation, no sense of occasion, just a quiet awareness that something irreversible was about to take place whether I spoke or not. The venue filled slowly. Familiar faces moved through the room, dressed carefully, smiling with the kind of politeness people use when they're unsure how they're supposed to feel. I noticed who was missing. The absence of my mother's friends was not subtle if you knew to look for it. It was a curated room designed to hold only one version of the story. She looked composed, radiant even. My father stood beside her, shoulders squared, as if he'd rehearsed the posture of a man certain of his choice. They thanked me more than once that morning, for everything, for being so understanding. I nodded, I always nodded. When the reception began, conversations floated easily. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell. I took my seat with the speech folded neatly in my bag, the paper soft from being read and reread too many times. I didn't know yet if I would stand up. I only knew that I couldn't leave without deciding. When my name was announced, there was a brief ripple of surprise. People turned. Some smiled warmly, expecting something sentimental. I walked to the microphone slowly, aware of my breathing, the weight of the room settling into silence. I didn't look at her first, I looked at my father. I was asked to say a few words, I began, my voice steady, almost calm. And I want to be clear, I'm not here to hurt anyone. A few heads tilted, the room leaned in. I want to speak honestly, because honesty is the only thing that allows families to survive change. I spoke about my mother, briefly. Respectfully, I acknowledged the grief we had all shared. I spoke about how loss can blur boundaries, how loneliness can make choices feel inevitable. No names, no accusations, then I paused. There are stories we tell others, I continued, and stories we tell ourselves. Sometimes they are not the same. The silence grew heavier. I felt it then, not fear but resolve. I was not included in many of the conversations that led us here. I was informed, not invited. And while I have tried to support what I did not choose, I cannot pretend this has been easy or uncomplicated or painless. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I share this not to disrupt today, I said, but to honor the truth that often gets edited out for the sake of comfort. I thanked the guests for listening. I wished the couple clarity, not happiness, clarity. When I stepped away from the microphone, no one clapped. They didn't know how. The absence of applause felt appropriate. Some truths don't ask for approval. Later, people approached me quietly, a hand on my arm. A look that said more than words. No one argued. No one challenged what I'd said. That, more than anything, told me I hadn't imagined the imbalance. She didn't speak to me again that day. My father tried once later that evening. He looked smaller somehow. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," I replied, "but I had to stop pretending." And for the first time since this all began, I felt something close to relief. The days after the wedding were quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic fallout, no series of confrontations waiting to unfold. Instead, there was distance, a deliberate, careful space that settled between us like a new boundary drawn without discussion. I returned to my routines, though they felt different now. Not emptier, clearer. I woke early as I always had, but the mornings no longer carried the same tension. I wasn't bracing myself for the next adjustment, the next compromise. For the first time in a long while, my thoughts belonged entirely to me. My father called a week later. His voice sounded tired, not angry, just worn. We spoke about practical things at first: paperwork, a repair that needed attention. Eventually, he said my name in the way he used to when he wanted to say something difficult. "I didn't realize how much you were carrying," he said. I let the silence stretch before answering. "I didn't either," I admitted. He didn't apologize, not fully, and I didn't ask him to. Some conversations don't arrive as complete resolutions. They arrive as acknowledgements, and you decide whether that's enough for now. I saw her once, unexpectedly, at a grocery store. She hesitated when she noticed me, then approached with careful steps. Her expression held something I hadn't seen before: uncertainty. "I hope you know I never meant to hurt you," she said. I studied her face, searching for something familiar. "I know," I replied, and I did. Intention and impact are rarely aligned, especially when people convince themselves they're choosing happiness. We didn't linger. There was nothing left to negotiate. Over time, I began reclaiming parts of myself I hadn't realized I'd set aside. I rearranged the house, gave away items I no longer needed to keep out of obligation. I spent afternoons with friends who knew how to sit in silence without filling it. I learned to say no without explanation. Healing, I discovered, wasn't about restoring what had been lost. It was about accepting that some structures can't be rebuilt, only released. I no longer planned gatherings for people who didn't ask how I was. I stopped smoothing over discomfort to make others feel at ease. These were small changes, invisible to most, but they altered the shape of my life in ways that felt profound. My relationship with my father settled into something quieter, more honest. We spoke less often, but with fewer assumptions. I no longer tried to protect him from the consequences of his choices. That wasn't my role anymore. What surprised me most was the absence of bitterness. I had expected it to linger, to demand attention. Instead, it softened as I learned to trust myself again, to believe that noticing something wrong didn't make me unkind, that speaking the truth calmly wasn't cruelty. I didn't win anything by standing up at that microphone. I didn't lose anything either. What I gained was something simpler and far more necessary. I gained my place back in my own life. When I look back now, the moments that matter most aren't the ones people remember. Not the wedding, not the silence that followed, not even the speech. What stays with me are the quieter choices, the ones no one applauds. Choosing to stop explaining myself, choosing to notice when something feels wrong, choosing not to trade my dignity for someone else's comfort. For a long time, I believed love meant endurance. That if I could just hold on quietly, things would eventually sort themselves out. But love without honesty slowly turns into absence, and absence, when ignored, becomes a kind of erasure. What I learned, later than I wish I had, is that boundaries aren't punishments. They're acknowledgements. They tell us where we end and where others begin. They allow relationships to exist without requiring our disappearance. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own life in it, I hope you take something gentle from my story. You don't need a dramatic moment to justify choosing yourself. You don't need permission to step back when something costs you too much. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak calmly and let the room decide what to do with the truth. So I'll leave you with the question I had to ask myself long after the chairs were folded and the lights were turned off. How much of yourself have you been quietly giving away just to keep the peace? Thank you for sitting with me. You weren't just listening, you were understanding.